4. Restoring justice. 4.1. The difficulty of repairing distributed damages. Now that the libertarian case against the Microsoft monopoly has been made, there remains to establish what should be done about it, according to libertarians. Libertarians all agree that the current governmental settlement, with Microsoft giving zillions worth, on paper, of computer software to schools, is not any kind of atonement for the prejudice caused to millions of people who are not any of these schoolchildren. On the contrary, it is but a marketing move to increase the number of victims, and the previously considered penalty, consisting in splitting Microsoft into separate companies with a prohibition for those companies to cooperate, was even worse of a measure to take. It would have repaired absolutely nothing, and benefited absolutely no one, and only have introduced inefficiency in software development. The privileges would have remained as strong as ever, only more expensive to the public. Indeed, splitting a criminal organisation into several parts doesn't make the resulting organisations any less criminal, for crime is characterised by the activity, by the fact that the means used by these organisations are disrespectful of the liberty and property of third parties. Splitting a criminal organisation into smaller chunks might make the crime less visible, by being more diffuse, and it can even isolate some legitimate activities from those illegitimate activities that make the organisation criminal, but it can't magically turn these illegitimate activities into legitimate activities. Libertarians reject the above-stated stances of a justice that consists in fines that benefit unconcerned third parties, while leaving the victims as helpless as ever, or in imposing regulations that make the racket inefficient without it ceasing to be a racket. Instead, libertarians defend the principle of reparative justice. That is, libertarians insist that justice should consist of the culprit repairing the damages done to his victims, together with interest and enforcement costs. Moreover, most libertarians insist that the culprit should be subject to penalties if he was acting in bad faith, as opposed to, say, accidental behaviour or excusable ignorance, since his denial of other people's rights justifies that he himself be denied similar rights. Now, it is difficult to repair past crimes, especially more so when the victims are diffuse or even worse, unknown. And in the Microsoft case, reparation is almost impossible to evaluate, since as with all cases of protectionism, the victims that suffered most are those people who were prevented from offering or purchasing services, so that these services never happened, and these people had to do something else instead. Thus, reparations are an important question to try to solve, but there is no consensus among libertarians, and not even any widely accepted theory as to what procedure to follow in such cases. If you have satisfying solutions to propose, you will certainly be listened to with attention. 4.2. The urgent problem. However, putting aside the difficulty of a truly just reparation to be paid by Microsoft to its victims, I will propose another problem. A problem that is much more urgent than the problem of reparation, and that makes it pale in comparison to the point of being insignificant and almost irrelevant. Yet a problem much simpler, and a problem that has an obvious solution. And this problem is, how can we stop further injustice? Indeed, making complex speculations as to how to best repair past damages done to mostly unidentified persons is all well and good, but stopping more damages to accumulate on and on should be the first and foremost problem justice has to solve. And here the solution is simple. It is to stop enforcing Microsoft's intellectual property privileges. Even if we were to believe such privileges may have some utilitarian justification in general, which they have not as a matter of fact, in this particular case at least they have been shown to lead to an ugly and evil monopoly, greatly detrimental to the public. So these privileges are not justified, and the very least should be to revoke them once again, at least in this case. Rather than argue about how to pay damages and interest back to the slaves to compensate for their losses, or conversely pay something to the slave owners to mitigate the loss due to a change in a law they followed in good faith, the urgent act of basic justice is to free the slaves. There will always be time to think about the possible reparations afterwards. Actually, once liberty is reclaimed, the forces of life will soon make all past injustice obsolete memories, reparations or no reparations. But while injustice continues, reparations are but a pretense for ever more suffering due to this continuing injustice. Therefore, the libertarian stance about the Microsoft monopoly is that the only urgent measure to take is to cancel the intellectual property privileges of Microsoft and to abolish the whole system of privileges that is information protectionism. Note that in the absence of reparations, Microsoft may very well continue to prosper once its privileges are abolished, and though libertarians would prefer that there be reparations, they won't object to the wealth of Microsoft managers in itself, and will reject any attempt by money grubbers to extract money from Microsoft's past crimes without a due claim showing that Microsoft owes them this money as a reparation for actual damages. Indeed, libertarians are not against prosperity, but against injustice. That Microsoft would thrive in a time where justice reigns would be but a tribute to the peaceful and prosperous nature of a free world that benefits everyone, even those who think that privilege is better for them. 4.3. Privilege containment versus privilege factories. Libertarians don't expect government and its monopoly system of justice to ever reckon and enforce the libertarian principles of justice. In the absence of such justice, libertarians find hope in what remains of the forces of a free society. Indeed, free market forces can slowly build ways around government monopolies. One way by which the free market reacts is through avoidance of government involvement at all. In other words, through the black market, which is the only truly free market, as opposed to the regulated private market that pays its tribute to government. In the case of Microsoft and other software monopolies instituted by government, this means all the so-called piracy, with people using, copying, modifying, distributing, enhancing and otherwise servicing software copyrighted by Microsoft and other privileged parties, without any such thing as a license from the privilege holder, without an official invoice for the services being exchanged, without taxes being paid to government during the transaction. But this free market also includes software developed outside of government regulations and privileges, software that is being developed without being trademarked or registered with government bodies, and again without any official transaction as to services exchanged, the truly free software. When free software emerges from the truly free market and makes its way into the private markets and the public administrations, it isn't truly free software anymore. But the rules that emerged in the truly free market may be formalized with more or less success, so as to turn them into contracts that will be held in the context of the government protection racket. Thus can be understood the so-called free software movement. It is a contractual relinquishment of regulatory privileges by all the parties involved in a software project. The involved parties may still have to pay tribute to the government when they make any official transactions, but at least they cease to fight the privilege war against each other while using the software. By using these social techniques of privilege containment, the forces of the free market manage to reduce the impact of government privileges on society. Still, what this means is that there are forces that counter and limit the evil of government. It doesn't mean that this evil magically stops to be evil, or suddenly becomes good. Society grows natural defences to contain the evil, but all that is invaded and not protected by these defences is lost, and also lost is all that it costs to establish these defences themselves. As long as de jure monopolies exist, their consequence is that people will suffer. Resources are shifted by the monopoly from their legitimate owners, who would use them responsibly in self-rewarding uses, to robbers who will use them irresponsibly, so as to keep and further their monopoly. Now, even if the natural defence mechanisms of society could very well overcome existing privileges, the problem with information protectionism is that it is not just a fixed set of monopolies and privileges. It is a monopoly factory that creates ever more monopolies. Intellectual property hoarders constantly register more and more privileged works into the system. They make ever broader claims in courts. They lobby parliaments for ever more privileges, tighter legislation, increased surveillance, and ruthless enforcement. And in the case of information protectionism, as in all their interventions, legislative bodies are but factories for ever more means of protectionism, privileges, etc. Their legislation is useless or harmful. When it is ineffective, it is useless. When it is effective, it is harmful, for it may only serve to prevent legitimate activities. And of course, all the spending of resources for enacting and enforcing legislation, either effectively or ineffectively, is itself a harmful waste. That is why it is not possible to ignore the activity of these looters, and hope that society will naturally override their activity with new defense mechanisms, because looters innovate and grow defenses too. They are actively inventing new ways to loot the creators. 4.4. What about the bigger monopoly? The problem with Microsoft's monopoly is relatively minor. With free software and free software, society could ultimately make this particular monopoly irrelevant given enough time, though it may cost all the resources wasted during that time. People will end up using free software and ignoring any software upon which intellectual property claims are enforced. But the same isn't true of the problem with the source of Microsoft's monopoly, that is, government. Government won't go away by simply ignoring it, because government consists precisely in invading people's lives, whether they like it or not. It doesn't leave you the choice of not interacting with it. So while it is important to know what should be done about Microsoft, namely to cancel its privileges, the more important question is to determine what should be done about government that caused the whole mess to begin with. We will soon reach the conclusion that what should be done is to identify and cancel the government's uber privilege, the source of all privileges. The tricky problem will be how such a thing can be achieved. However, the solution to this particular problem deserves a study of its own and is beyond the scope of this long enough essay. The first thing to do is to understand the nature of government and of privilege, so that whatever is done to existing governments is not, like splitting Microsoft, the displacement of the very same evil into different entities with different names without removing anything from that evil. To make a long story short, the source of the evil is in coercion, the resort to force to deprive people of the liberty of using their legitimately acquired property as they see fit, and to evade the responsibility of one's decisions. Coercion is the tool that characterizes government when people submit to it, and that characterizes bandits when people resist it. To a libertarian, whether done by people wearing an official blue ribbon or by plain outlaws, both kinds of coercion are just as criminal. In other words, might does not make right. Once these basic concepts are understood, things are easily put in their place, and it is possible to determine the proper limits of government. The government should do nothing. It shouldn't exist, for in a libertarian society there is no place for coercion. Of course, in a libertarian society there is still a place for people who build roads and manage infrastructures, for people who work at ensuring justice and security, for people who teach, for people who check the size of bananas, for people who develop software, and for people who have all other marginally useful jobs that coercive governments try to make believe won't happen without their direct or indirect intervention. Instead, these jobs will happen on the basis of voluntary exchange of service. Each person can individually choose with whom to contract, negotiate the conditions of services and payment, and withhold one's customership from those providers who do not bring individual satisfaction. Once these principles are settled, each person's own authority becomes obvious. The limits of each of these service providers' powers are their own property, and the property voluntarily entrusted to them by their customers. As for coercive governments, just like any coercive institutions, they are wholly illegitimate, and absolutely nothing is included in the limit of things permitted to them. They ought to be made non-coercive, or simply abolished, which is one and the same. Conclusion. In the case between government and Microsoft, libertarians don't have to take sides. Their role is to reveal and delegitimize the common principle of injustice behind these two evils and their sameness of nature and origin, hidden as they are under a veil of propaganda and censorship. Both are de jure monopolies, established in the name of the public interest, but actually in the private interest of monopolists, under the a priori axiom that politics is a universal solution to any problem. Libertarianism rejects the political view of the world as a struggle in which what matters is what side you identify with. Libertarians defend justice and the natural principles of law that underlie it. For libertarianism is a theory of law, a theory of what is or isn't legitimate for individuals to do. The libertarian tradition has always strived to delegitimize the privileges of those who claim to live at the expense of others through force and fraud. But more than that, libertarians seek to delegitimize the political power that grants those privileges to begin with, and that can do nothing but grant privileges. We show the naked injustice, without its drapings of false justifications, for truth is the greatest ally of justice. We libertarians are abolitionists. License Agreement. By reading this article, you agree to run around the room you are currently in, flapping your arms and squawking like a chicken. By linking to this article, recommending it, talking about it, or commenting on it, you agree to owe me $1 zillion. Make it 2 zillions if you dare to criticize it. By thinking about this article, you agree that all my opinions, stated or unstated, are correct. By disclosing any information whatsoever about this article, you agree to surrender to me your wife, respectively girlfriend, husband, inflatable doll, etc., your firstborn child, and your eternal soul. I will get your earthly body to boot if you use any word with the letter M while discussing my article. Failure to comply with this license will entail the thought police bursting into your home, seizing your assets, and throwing you into the jails of the Ministry of Love, where you will be re-educated into a joyfully law-abiding citizen. It will also entail your ultimately burning in hell, though that is probably going to happen anyway. Note that in addition to this license, you may or may not be subject to the end seller license.